I only needed shelter. But that silent loom seemed to remember my family.
No room, no family, no winter coat worth naming, just 2 maple shuttles wrapped in a dish towel and $63.17 she had saved from mending hems. And with that money, she bought a silk ribbon loom house abandoned in Paterson, Passaic County, New Jersey since 1978, when its address vanished from city maps. 3 skylights stood open to rain. The floor sagged beneath the Jacquard frame. Passaic County condemned it on October 4, 2022, and scheduled demolition for the coming spring. But high inside, the loom's punch card reader waited a cedar compartment unopened for decades, holding money, names, and a message meant for hands patient enough to find it. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Sophie Elena Mercer had been leaving her whole life without knowing it. Her father left before she learned his middle name. Her mother, Lena, died when Sophie was 12, after an illness that reduced their apartment to medicine bottles and unopened curtains. Sophie learned that departure did not always make a sound. Sometimes it cooled beside untouched tea. Lena worked with silk because it demanded honesty. A loose warp showed, a hurried knot showed. She kept her tools in cedar and taught Sophie to wax thread before drawing it through a heddle so the fibers passed cleanly. On Saturdays, they took 2 buses to Lena's father, Elias Mercer, who rented the back floor of a narrow brick house near the Passaic River. Elias had spent 43 years threading ribbon looms, first in a mill and later alone, repairing sashes, hatbands, and Jacquard trim. His left thumbnail was permanently split from guiding silk under tension. He set a kettle on the iron stove, spread punched cards across the table, and asked Sophie to read them as music. Hole, no hole, lift, rest. Then she climbed the loom bench and separated warp ends with a brass hook while he counted under his breath. At noon, they ate rye bread with mustard. At dusk, he swept every clipping before turning off the green-shaded lamp. A pattern is only memory given discipline, Elias told her after she reversed 2 cards and ruined 6 inches of ribbon. He made her keep the mistake so she would learn that repair begins by seeing where the order broke. He died in February 2018 during a week of sleet. By the time Sophie and Lena reached his rooms, the landlord had emptied them. The loom had gone to salvage. Card boxes, winding frame, bobbins, hooks, and notebooks had vanished in a truck. Lena found only 2 maple shuttles beneath a radiator. After Lena died, Sophie went to Aunt Marion in Clifton. Marion kept plastic runners over the carpet and turned photographs from the sun. She disliked loose ends, steam-on mirrors, and objects without resale value. The cedar chest remained under Sophie's bed. Marion spoke softly when angry, making every cupboard door sound guilty. On November 7, 2022, Sophie came home early and found a man in a camel coat kneeling beside the open chest. He had arranged Lena's bobbin winder, thread gauge, steel scissors, and brass denting hook on the dining table. Marion stood by the window holding an envelope. The dealer lifted the scissors. Sophie crossed the room, took them from him, and returned each tool to the box. Her hands did not shake until she reached the shuttles. Marion placed Sophie's house key between them. "Take those relics and leave before supper tonight." 8 words. Marion looked past her into the dark television, where both appeared faintly in the glass. She did not mention Lena. As Sophie lifted the chest, Marion laid the faded dish towel on top, the one Lena had kept beneath her teapot. Because she said nothing, it felt more final than cruelty. The chest was too heavy to carry beyond the bus stop. Sophie left it with a Main Avenue pawnshop keeper for $20 and a 30-day promise. She kept the tools and wrapped the shuttles in the towel. For 6 weeks she moved according to warmth. She slept in the Paterson bus terminal until a guard recognized her. In Newark, she folded into a Penn Station chair beneath the clicking departure board. In Jersey City, she spent 4 nights in a church shelter and 1 beneath a tailor shop awning on Bergen Avenue. Her money fell by exact stages. $58.42 after fare, $41.09 after laundry and cough syrup, $26.60 after replacing a split shoe, then $11.07. She ate peanut butter packets and learned which libraries opened first. Each evening she unwrapped the shuttles, checked them for cracks, and wrapped them again. At the Paterson Free Public Library on Broadway, warmth rose through a brass grate beside the classified binders. Sophie had entered to dry her socks. On a bottom shelf she found a county surplus notice folded inside an old newspaper. Condemned industrial outbuilding, Ward 6, quit-claim deed, minimum bid $2. Purchaser assumes liens and demolition liability. Someone had circled silk loom fixtures remain in blue pencil. She copied the parcel number onto a bus receipt. An elderly librarian with silver hair found the tax map and showed her a brick shape behind warehouses. The bid deadline was the next morning. Sophie had $717 left. She set aside $2 for the property, $2.75 for fare, and kept the rest for food. Before sunrise, she tucked Alina's brass thread gauge into her coat and walked toward the county clerk's office with the shuttles knocking softly against her ribs. By noon, the house that had outlived its trade would have an owner younger than its broken windows. The bus left Newark before daylight, carrying Sophie north through wet streets and the last gray strips of factory country. She sat beside the window with Lena's tools between her boots and counted each transfer against the coins in her pocket. From the final stop she walked 4 miles, slept one night in the clean corner of a hay barn beyond Totowa, and woke to 28 degrees and frost silvering the cuffs of her coat. Paterson appeared slowly, first as brick walls beyond the river mist, then as signs opening one by one. Corrado's Bakery lifted its steel shutter. A woman swept the doorway of Albasha Grocery. Steam clouded the windows at Libby's Lunch. Grand Hardware displayed snow shovels beneath a striped awning, and the Palace Barber Shop turned on a red pole that revolved without warmth. Sophie passed all 5 with the parcel number folded inside her glove. The county clerk's office occupied the second floor of a stone building where radiators struck and cooled like tired pipes. Sophie climbed the stairs, crossed a floor polished by generations of winter shoes, and entered a room divided by oak counters and green filing cabinets. The woman behind the property desk had a white streak at the center of her black hair and wore a chain that kept her reading glasses close to her collar. Her nameplate said Mrs. Evelyn Vargas. She looked at Sophie, then at the damp bus receipt bearing the parcel number. "You are here for the industrial forfeiture." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Vargas pulled a folder from beneath the counter. "You understand the roof is open." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand there is no water service." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand the city may require stabilization before occupancy." "Yes, ma'am." "You understand demolition remains possible if you miss the compliance dates." "Yes, ma'am." The clerk held Sophie's gaze for a moment, perhaps waiting for bravado, but found only a young woman standing very still with a dish towel tucked under one arm. She placed the bid form on the counter and pointed to 3 lines with the capped end of her pen. Sophie printed her name carefully. The $2 bill she surrendered was soft at the fold and still carried a blue ink mark from the library copier. Mrs. Vargas laid it beneath a glass paperweight, signed the deed, and brought down a brass stamp with a heavy, final click. "Straight along Market Street," she said. "Left at Spruce, then south toward the Old Mill District. The access lane begins behind the chain-link yard opposite Slater Street. You will see 2 stone gateposts. The western one is split." She began sliding the papers into an envelope, then stopped. Mercer. Sophie looked up. Mrs. Vargas opened the folder again and read the previous deed. "Was Elias Mercer your grandfather?" The room seemed to narrow around the oak counter. "Yes, ma'am. I knew the name from my father. He worked at a dye house near Straight Street. Said Elias could hear a loom fault before the foreman reached the floor." She turned one yellowed page toward Sophie. "Your grandfather filed a preservation petition for this building in 1987. It was denied. He filed again in 1994. Sophie touched the edge of the paper but did not lift it. Did he own it? No. The Haviland Ribbon Company did, but he was listed as caretaker after they closed. Mrs. Vargas read farther. He paid the minimum tax lien twice to delay seizure. There's a note here that he stored personal equipment on site. What kind? The record does not say. Mrs. Vargas returned the page to the file and sealed the envelope. Her expression softened only slightly. He kept that building from disappearing longer than anyone knew. Sophie placed the deed inside her coat. Outside, the river wind had sharpened. She followed Market Street past buses, repair shops, and brick walls patched with newer brick. At Spruce Street, the sidewalks narrowed. A man washing paintbrushes behind a body shop raised 2 fingers in greeting. Farther on, an elderly woman in a red knit cap stood beside a low fence while a brindled dog pressed its nose through the wire. "You looking for the old ribbon place?" the woman called. Sophie nodded. "Dog's name is Arthur. Mine's June." She pointed with one gloved hand. "Stay left where the lane forks, right side floods." Arthur gave one grave bark, then returned to smelling the frozen ground. Beyond the fence, the road became cracked asphalt edged with black walnut trees. Their bare limbs crossed overhead and split husks lay dark in the weeds. The old factories appeared between them, long structures with boarded windows and sawtooth roofs, until Sophie reached the 2 stone gateposts. The western one had opened through the middle exactly as Mrs. Vargas said. The Loom house stood 30 feet beyond the gate. It was a brick rectangle, roughly 24 feet wide and 40 feet long, built in courses darkened by soot and weather. A shallow roof ran behind a broken parapet. 3 north-facing skylights gaped along the ridge, their frames holding only teeth of glass. The chimney leaned less than it had seemed to in the tax photograph, though several bricks near the top had powdered white. Above the main door hung a rusted sign. Haviland Silk Ribbon. Sample House Number 2. Sophie unlocked the city padlock with the key Mrs. Vargas had given her. The chain fell heavily against the brick. The door opened 6 inches and stopped against swollen floorboards. She leaned her shoulder into it until rotted wood surrendered with a damp crack. Cold air came out carrying brick dust, old grease, and the dry mineral smell of abandoned cloth. The front room received light through holes in the skylights. Rain had darkened the floor beneath them into long stains, and every step answered with a different complaint. Near the wall stood a cutting table with one leg braced by a stack of punched cards. A spool rack leaned forward, except for a few threads that trembled in the draft. The massive loom filled the center of the room. Its frame was walnut gone nearly black, taller than Sophie and twice the reach of her arms. Iron weights hung behind the harness. Thousands of heddles remained in their order, furred with dust. Above them rose the Jacquard mechanism, a wooden crown of levers, hooks, needles, and the box-shaped reader that once accepted a chain of punched cards. Sophie set down her bundle and placed her palm against the breastbeam. The wood was colder than stone. When she tapped it with one fingernail, the sound traveled deep into the frame. The back room had served as both finishing space and office. A cracked sink stood beneath a pipe stained green at the joint. Shelves held glass jars smelling faintly of gum, Arabic, and oil. She found mouse droppings in a drawer, a dead moth inside a teacup, and one square of blue silk caught behind a radiator. It was no larger than a postage stamp, but the color had survived. By dusk, the building had grown colder than the street. Sophie swept a dry strip of floor beside the loom and spread newspaper beneath her coat. For supper, she ate half a roll saved from Corrado's bakery and drank water from a fountain she had passed 2 blocks away. The brick walls released the day's cold slowly. Somewhere above her, loose metal clicked in the wind. She could taste dust each time she swallowed. Her fingertips smelled of walnut and machine oil. The floor pressed hard against her hip, and the draft touched the back of her neck as if testing whether she would stay. Before sleeping, Sophie unwrapped the 2 maple shuttles and placed them beneath the loom where Elias might once have stood. One still held a short length of Lena's red silk, faded at the end where years of handling had worn it pale. History is woven by the quiet hands of those who refuse to give up. By first light, Sophie was outside with a borrowed bucket, following the sound of water behind the building. The well stood beneath a warped cedar cover 20 yards from the back door. Its hand pump had frozen at the handle, but the iron pipe remained sound. She wrapped it with the dish towel, poured a cup of library fountain water over the joint, and worked the handle until brown water coughed into the bucket. After 14 strokes, it cleared. She boiled every cup she drank. The outhouse leaned toward the walnuts, but still had a roof. She replaced one hinge with wire found beneath the cutting table and learned to carry the lantern low because the upper boards were loose enough to strike her forehead in wind. Inside, the floor spoke in a language she began to understand. The plank by the sink gave a dry click. The board beside the loom sighed without bending. A dark patch near the north wall flexed half an inch under her heel, so she marked it with chalk and walked around it. By the third day, she could cross the front room after dark without waking every nail. She met the hardware store owner on the fourth morning. Grand Hardware smelled of rope, fertilizer, and the hot dust that gathers above old radiators. Narrow drawers covered one wall from floor to ceiling, each labeled in pencil. Behind the counter stood Mr. Samuel Grand, a broad man whose right ear had been folded flat long ago and never healed straight. He listened while Sophie described the chimney, the open skylights, and the floor. "Cash account?" he asked. "I have $1.42. That is not an account." "No, sir." He studied the brass thread gauge she had set beside her coins. Then he opened a ruled ledger, wrote Sophie Mercer across the top of a clean page, and drew a line beneath it. "You pay when you can. You do not vanish. I won't." He placed a stained paperback on the counter. The cover read, "Repairs for the Practical Homeowner, 1966 edition. Free," he said, "because nobody should repair a roof from memory." She bought only what could not wait. A chimney brush for $6.80, 20 feet of jointed fiberglass rod for $4.25, a pound of stove cement for $2.10, work gloves for $1.35, and a galvanized stovepipe collar for $3.60. Mr. Grand added a box of bent but usable nails without entering it in the ledger. The chimney came first. Sophie tied a rope around her waist and looped it through the iron bracket above the rear door, not because the bracket was strong enough to save her, but because it might slow a fall. She climbed the interior ladder to the roof hatch, crawled on hands and knees to the chimney, and lowered the round wire brush through the flue 1 3-foot section at a time. The first pass moved less than a yard. Creosote had narrowed the throat into a black glassy ring. She twisted the rod clockwise, never backward, then drew it up 6 inches and drove it down again. Each stroke released flakes that struck the firebox below like dry seeds. Wind carried soot across her face and settled it along the wet edge of her sleeves. After 2 hours, the brush broke through the first obstruction. After 4, she had cleared the upper flue. She climbed down, removed 3 buckets of creosote from the hearth, and returned to the roof for the lower bend. By the 7th hour, her shoulders shook when she lifted the rod. She stopped only when the brush passed from crown to firebox without catching. The next morning, she packed the loose joint at the collar with stove cement, waited until afternoon, and built a test fire from newspaper, walnut twigs, and 1 split length of dry pine found under the cutting table. Smoke rolled once across the hearth, then lifted cleanly. She held her palm near the draft. It pulled steadily upward. For her first hot meal in the house, Sophie heated a dented tin of beans in a saucepan Mr. Grand had taken from the store's back room. The fire gave little warmth at first, but the beans loosened from their cold shape and began to smell of salt and tomato. She ate beside the hearth with the spoon wrapped in cloth because the handle grew hot. The workroom changed once the soot was gone. She opened the shutters and carried each useful object into the light. A brass temple for keeping woven cloth at width. 6 perns still wound with brittle ivory silk. A card lacing frame with 1 broken peg. A magnifying glass fixed to an iron arm. A weaver's knotter worn smooth at the thumb. 2 copper dye pots nested together. A ledger swollen by damp, and a narrow reed stamped 48 dents to the inch. She cleaned no more than she could understand. The punched cards beneath the cutting table had softened beyond use, but a second chain hung behind the loom, stiff with age and tied in a cotton sleeve. Sophie lifted it onto the table. Each card held rows of square perforations. Elias had taught her that the holes were not decoration. They were instructions. Which hooks rose, which warp threads waited, where silk crossed silk to make a figure appear. The Jacquard head remained nearly 10 feet above the floor. She found a rolling ladder under canvas, tested each rung, and pushed it against the loom. Halfway up, she heard something shift, not the scrape of a weight, not the faint clatter of hooks. A dull wooden knock came from inside the reader housing. Sophie climbed down and tapped the loom frame with the handle of the knotter. Walnut answered sharply. The reader box answered lower. She struck the right side, then the left. The left panel sounded hollow except near its center, where the tone shortened as though something rested behind it. She removed the panel's 4 screws. The wood did not move. At the top edge she found a cedar disc no wider than a quarter, darkened to match the walnut. It looked decorative until she pressed it. The disc turned beneath her thumb. A latch released inside the housing. The panel came forward an inch and stopped against unexpected weight. Sophie braced one knee on the ladder and eased it down. Behind it sat 3 parcels wrapped in waxed linen, fitted so closely into the hidden space that the cloth bore the shape of the mechanism. She carried them to the cutting table one at a time. The first parcel was tied with red silk thread. Sophie worked the knot loose rather than cutting it. Inside lay a set of heirloom tools, a bone-handled threading hook, 2 polished shuttle tips, a small steel card punch, and a brass loop engraved EM. The metal held the faint odor of camphor from the cloth. The second parcel contained raw material. 4 hanks of silk rested beneath tissue, each wound around a paper collar marked with weight and twist. One was black, one cream, one the deep red Lena had favored, and one blue so dark it appeared colorless until Sophie carried it near the window. The third parcel was heavier. She untied the linen and found a tin document box sealed along its lid with black wax. The wax broke under the card punch. Inside lay a folded letter, a packet of punched cards, and stacks of currency banded with paper turned yellow at the edges. Sophie did not touch the letter. She lifted out the money and counted it on the table, first by denomination, then again from the beginning. There were old $20 bills, 10s, 5s, and singles, most issued before she was born. Beneath them lay cloth rolls of coins, silver dollars, walking liberty, half-dollars, mercury dimes, and Indian head cents blackened around the rims. The total came to $34,200. At the bottom of the box rested a bronze victory medal dated 1919. Its faded ribbon had once been rainbow-colored. A narrow bar across it read, France. Sophie counted the money a third time. Then she returned every bill to its band, every coin to its cloth roll, and the medal to the bottom of the tin. She set the unopened letter on top. The packet of punched cards remained beside it, bound with cord and labeled in Elias's hand, for the women who stood at the gates. Night had settled beyond the skylights. Sophie carried the lantern outside and walked to the river. Meltwater moved black between the stone banks, taking reflections of warehouse windows and breaking them without sound. She sat on the cold retaining wall until her hands stopped trembling. She did not read the letter. History is woven by the quiet hands of those who refuse to give up. Morning entered through the broken skylights and narrow bars. Sophie set the tin box on the cutting table and warmed her fingers around a cup of boiled well water before unfolding the letter. She knew the handwriting at once. Elias had formed his capital letters like loom hooks, upright with a small inward curve, each line measured as carefully as warp. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the cedar panel, then you listened before you forced anything. That is the first qualification for this house. My name is Elias Matthew Mercer. Dr. Helen Strauss at St. Joseph's Hospital in Paterson has told me that the cancer in my pancreas has reached my liver. She expects months, not years. I am writing while my hands are still exact. The money beneath this letter was earned slowly and hidden deliberately. Some came from repairs after the mills closed. Some came from ribbon orders paid in cash by women who did not want their husbands asking questions. I kept it because a trade without a roof becomes a memory too quickly. You should know whose hands came before yours. My great-grandmother, Adeline Mercer, born in Macclesfield in 1842, came to Paterson in 1866 and threaded broad silk looms on Van Buren Street. Her daughter Rose, born here in 1871, punched cards for Haviland and organized supper collections during the strike winter of 1913. Rose's daughter, Miriam, born in 1896, carried ribbon samples between Paterson and New York until influenza closed the trains. Miriam's son, Thomas, my father, was born in 1920 and taught me to dress a warp without crossing one end. I was born in 1941 and entered the sample house at 16. The ribbon trade in this building closed on September 30th, 1978. After that came more than 30 years of silence. I visited when I could, oiled the shafts, turned the beam, and kept rain from the cardstock. My brother Daniel did the same before he was killed in Korea in 1951. The medal below belongs to him. He carried one of Rose's woven bookmarks in his breast pocket. The cards, bound with cord, hold a pattern Rose designed after the silk strikes. If they are read in order, the loom will weave the names of women who stood outside the gates and demanded honest hours. Do not run them until the mechanism is clean. When you do begin, keep the silk room between 68 and 72 degrees. Soak dry skeins in 1 part white vinegar to 20 parts water for 12 minutes, then blot without twisting. Dress the warp at no more than 6 ounces of tension per end. Oil the Jacquard needles sparingly, 1 drop for every 8 hooks, and wait a full night before running the cards. If the selvage draws inward, stop. Do not correct a bad edge by pulling harder. Inheritance is not possession. It is the work placed into your hands before another pair grows tired. Keep what helps you continue. Use what must be used. Leave something in working order for the person who comes after. Behind the building, near the western walnut, you will find a low stone marker cut with a shuttle. Daniel and I placed it there after our mother died. Light the brass lamp for her once, if it still holds oil. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Elias Matthew Mercer March, Teen, 2017. Sophie read the letter twice. On the second reading, she rested one fingertip beside each name as though checking ends in a warp. Then she folded the pages along their original creases, smoothing them with the bone handle of the threading hook. The paper returned to its shape without resistance. She carried the lantern through the back door and crossed the hard ground toward the western walnut. Briars caught her sleeves. At the tree's riverside, half hidden by moss, a low gray stone rose from the soil. A shuttle had been carved into its face, simple and worn. Beneath it were 2 initials, LM. Sophie cleared the leaves with both hands. She did not speak. The marker had waited through winters, floodwater, and the long interval when no Mercer crossed the yard. Back inside, she searched the shelves until she found a small brass lamp beneath a collapsed roll of patterned paper. Its wick had hardened, but the reservoir held a thumb's depth of old oil. She trimmed the black edge with Lena's scissors, set the lamp on the stone outside, and touched a match to it. The flame rose blue, then settled into gold. She remembered Mrs. Vargas keeping the $2 bill beneath glass instead of treating it as a joke. She remembered Mr. Grand opening a credit ledger when she had almost nothing to enter into it. She remembered June pointing out the flooded fork while Arthur watched from the fence. None of them had asked for her history before giving her a way forward. There are kindnesses so small that the person offering them may forget by supper, while the person receiving them carries them for years. Before this story moves on, think of one such kindness someone once gave you. A meal, a ride, a door held open when you had nowhere certain to go. Tell us what it was and who gave it. That night, Sophie placed the brass loop, the threading hook, and Lena's 2 shuttles beside her folded coat. The tin box rested beneath the table, closed but no longer hidden. She slept facing the loom, with the letter under her hand. The first snow came on December 2nd, 6 inches laid quietly over the broken skylights and the walnut roots. Sophie woke with powder sifted across the loom's breast beam. Before touching the ladder, she read the roofing chapter in Mr. Grand's manual 3 times, tracing every diagram with Lena's brass gauge. The roof measured 24 by 40 feet with enough pitch to require 12 squares of asphalt shingles after waste, 3 rolls of 15-pound felt, and nearly 30 pounds of galvanized nails. Mr. Grand entered the materials in his ledger, then reached beneath the counter and handed her a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle. My brother used it 30 years. A former roofer named Walter Pike arrived that afternoon. He was 72, walked with one shoulder lower than the other, and refused the envelope Sophie offered. Keep it for the lumber. They worked 11 days. Walter showed her how to sister. A split rafter with a soundboard extending 3 feet beyond each weakness. How to snap a chalk line without smearing it, and how to set a roofing nail in 3 strokes. Place, drive, finish, that nail's proud. Set it again. She struck too hard and bent it. Pull it. Start with a clean hole. By mid-December, the felt lay smooth, the shingle courses met evenly beneath the ridge, and new glass covered the skylight frames. When rain came that night, Sophie sat beneath the loom and listened for drops. None reached the floor. January exposed what soot had hidden. 4 courses near the chimney crown were spalling, their fired faces peeling away in thin shells. Mortar beneath them had become pale powder that spilled whenever Sophie touched it with the point of a trowel. Walter told her not to use Portland cement on old brick. Mr. Grand measured hydraulic lime and fire clay into paper sacks, 3 parts lime to 1 part fire clay for the joints nearest heat. Sophie mixed only what she could place in 20 minutes, dampened each brick before bedding it, and pressed the mortar deep with a narrow jointer. For 3 weeks the temperature remained in the 20s. She worked barehanded because gloves dulled the pressure needed to feel a full joint. Every 15 minutes her fingers went numb. She climbed down, held them near the stove until pain returned, then climbed again. The final cap required 2 bricks cut by hand. Walter marked them with a mason's pencil and let Sophie make the cuts. She tapped around each line with the chisel until the waste released cleanly. On January 27th, they built a test fire from dry walnut and pine. Sophie stood outside while Walter watched the hearth. Smoke rose from the rebuilt crown in one straight column. Inside, the draft held clean, and no gray ribbon escaped through the joints. Walter warmed his hands above the stove. That will outlast both of us. The front room floor was white pine, though years of grease and rain had made it nearly black. Sophie lifted the failed boards beside the north wall and found hand-cut rose-head nails buried in the joists. She saved each one in a jar, straightened the usable nails against the iron bench, and replaced the rotten planks with boards cut to the same irregular widths. Mr. Grand rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day. She began with 80 grit, moving with the grain and keeping the machine in motion so it would not hollow the soft pine. The second pass at 120 removed the last gray scratches. The final 220 grit pass left the board smooth without erasing the shallow dents made by boots and loom carts. Dust settled into her eyelashes and turned the stove water cloudy. She vacuumed twice, wiped the floor with a barely damp cloth, and waited until morning before applying oil. 3 coats followed. She rubbed each one thin with folded cotton, let it penetrate, and wiped away every shining patch. After the last coat, the room remained closed for a 48-hour cure. The boards shifted from dark honey toward mahogany, and the rosehead nails appeared as small black constellations. One morning she woke before dawn and could not lift the sander. Nothing was broken and nothing required explanation. She walked to the marsh instead. A great blue heron stood in the shallows with its neck folded, patient enough to seem carved from the winter water. Sophie watched until afternoon. She did no work that day. At dusk, she returned, banked the stove, and left the tools where they were. 8 windows remained in the Loom house. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked from corner to corner. 1 held an original pane dated by its wavy surface and the 1788 sash beneath it. Sophie preserved that pane, working around it with both hands and refusing to scrape away the old seed bubbles trapped in the glass. She removed the damaged sash one at a time, softened the failed putty with low heat, and lifted the fragments without levering against the wood. For the new panes, she rolled Dieppe 33 glazing putty between her palms, pressed a thin bedding line into each rabbet, set the glass, and drove glazing points flat with the side of her putty knife. The outer bead was drawn in one steady pass, its angled face shedding water toward the sill. Several counterweights had fallen inside the wall pockets. Sophie opened the access panels, fed quarter-inch cotton sash cord over each pulley, and tied a figure-8 knot through the weight eye so the cord could not slip under load. The final window faced the western walnut. She raised the sash, tested the balance, and lowered it without a rattle. Outside, a chickadee landed on the nearest branch, its feet closing around a catkin stem no thicker than thread. Sophie rested the putty knife on the sill and watched until the bird flew. The walls revealed their age once the windows held out the wind. Horsehair plaster clung to hand-split oak lath in broad, uneven fields, but near the chimney it had loosened from heat and damp. Sophie attempted 3 patches there, and all 3 failed. The first cracked overnight. The second sagged, the third released from the lath in one complete piece and broke across the floor. Mr. Grand found an old burlap bag of horsehair in his storeroom, saved from his father's upholstery work. Sophie washed it, cut it short, and folded it into lime plaster until the fibers disappeared beneath the trowel. She pressed a scored scratch coat through the gaps in the lath, waited until it held firm, then laid a 3/8-inch brown coat and allowed it 72 hours to cure. The finish coat was 1/8 inch, thin enough to follow the old wall rather than flatten it. When the final patch dried without a crack, she ran her palm over its quiet curve. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris Bell from Libby's lunch began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before dawn. Doris wore her gray hair in a net and had a burn scar along one wrist. The bags held egg sandwiches, heel slices of pie, or soup sealed in jars with wax paper beneath the lids. When Sophie tried to pay, Doris pushed the coins back across the cafe counter. In candles when the shop reopens. Caleb Ortiz arrived one Saturday on a blue Schwinn with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 16, narrow as a lathe strip, and wore one red shoelace and one black. Without asking, he split the storm-fallen walnut limbs into stove lengths and stacked them bark side up beneath the eaves. Sophie offered him $2. He shook his head and adjusted the maul over his shoulder. My mother said, "About your grandfather." He rode away before she could ask what his mother had said. Reverend Boyd passed each morning at 7:10, carrying a dented steel thermos. He had a white beard trimmed square beneath his chin and walked as though measuring the road. He never entered unless invited. He tipped his hat when Sophie was on the roof and once held a ladder while she reset a gutter bracket. At the gate, he offered the same forward prayer. "Keep these hands steady." Then he continued toward Market Street. Sophie postponed the cellar until February 11th. The door beneath the rear stairs had swollen shut and the first pull lifted only a line of dust. She worked a flat bar around the frame until the wood released. Cold air rose, carrying stone, iron, and the faint sourness of standing water. 7 granite steps led down to a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor. At the center lay a dressed granite slab, rectangular and fitted too carefully to be ordinary paving. A small shuttle mark had been carved near one corner. Sophie swept around it but did not lift it. Under the third step, an oak box had been wedged behind a loose stone. Its lid opened on leather hinges. Inside lay a brass key whose bow had been shaped like a weaver's shuttle and a tintype wrapped in wool. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the Loom house in 1903. She held a card punch against her apron. Her hair was darker than Sophie's, but the eyes, the narrow chin, and the uneven left eyebrow were the same. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Rose Mercer, daughter of Adeline, age 25, summer of 1903. Sophie carried the photograph upstairs and placed it beside Elias's letter. The brass key remained on the mantel. She tried it in the desk, the tin box, the Loom cabinet, and every surviving door. It opened none of them. Snow withdrew from the yard in narrow gray islands. The creek beyond the warehouses grew loud with meltwater, and the walnut branches loosened pale green catkins that shook whenever freight trains passed. Sophie cleaned the loom but did not begin the full ribbon that spring. The hooks needed polishing. Several needles required replacement. And she did not yet trust her hands with Rose's card chain. She chose 1 mercury dime from the cache and spent its value on practice silk. On a small hand frame, she wove samples no wider than 2 fingers, testing tension, edge, and color until she could correct a crossed end without disturbing the rows around it. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, Sophie completed the first full ribbon. She had spent 3 days dressing the warp, passing each silk end through heddle and reed beneath the brass loop. The room held at 70 degrees. Rose's punched cards moved through the reader 1 deliberate turn at a time, their square holes meeting the needles with a dry, orderly click. At first, the ribbon showed only borders, black, cream, and deep red. Then letters emerged from the silk. Clara Lemlich, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Hannah Silverman. Women from mills, dye houses, winding rooms, and picket lines appeared in a narrow procession of names. Sophie stopped the loom after every yard to examine the selvage. The final strip measured 12 feet. She cut it with Lena's scissors and laid it across the table without applause. The restored interior remained plain. The floor held its dark warmth. Lime-washed walls reflected winter light upward toward the repaired skylights. The cutting table stood level again, the brass lamp beside it. On the mantel rested Rose's tintype, Daniel's medal, and the key that still opened nothing. Its answer came during a February thaw. Caleb, now taller and driving his uncle's pickup, helped Sophie clear a split limb from the western walnut. Beneath loose bark near the trunk, he found a greened brass plate fixed flush with the wood. At its center was a keyhole shaped like a narrow oval. The shuttle key turned once. A small compartment opened within the tree's old scar, lined with sheet copper. Inside lay a folded 48-star flag and a note tied with cotton thread. The paper had been written by Miriam Mercer on November 11, 1918, the day the armistice ended the First World War. She wrote that the flag had hung in the sample house window while Paterson's whistle sounded. She wrote that Rose had refused to ring the mill bell until the women on the night shift were released to hear the news. She asked whoever found the note to remember that wars were recorded by generals, but endured by mothers, sisters, loom fixers, dyers, and boys who had never slept outside their own state. The flag smelled faintly of copper and walnut. Sophie folded the note along its creases and placed it with Elias's letter. On July 27th, the anniversary of the Korean War armistice, she carried Daniel's victory medal to Cedar Lawn Cemetery in Paterson. The medal belonged to an earlier war, but Daniel had carried it into the one that killed him. She laid it beside his marker for the afternoon, then returned it to the mantel before rain. She used 4 coins from the cash. 1 mercury dime paid for the first practice silk. A walking Liberty $half covered the value of replacement needles. 2 Indian head cents bought nothing directly. She placed them beneath the loom's new foot blocks, heads upward, as Elias had once done beneath machines prone to shifting. The remaining bills and coins went back into the tin box. Sophie wrapped it in fresh waxed linen and returned it to the cedar compartment inside the Jacquard reader. On top, she placed a new paper band in her own handwriting. For the next one. The shop reopened without a sign in the window. Doris pinned an index card to the corkboard at Libby's lunch. Silk ribbon repairs, sample weaving, honest wait times. Beneath it, she wrote Sophie's post office box number. The first order was for 6 inches of black mourning ribbon. The second was a repair to a wedding sash. By spring, more than 40 names filled a mailing list kept in Elias's old ledger. Sophie accepted only the work she could finish carefully. No customer was promised speed. Doris received candles for every table in the cafe. Caleb returned one April morning carrying a hand-carved walnut sign wrapped in a blanket. He had copied the lettering from the rusted Haviland board, but changed the name. Mercer, Silk Ribbon and Daughters. Sophie ran her fingers over the final words. "There aren't any daughters," she said. Caleb set the sign against the wall and brushed sawdust from his sleeves. "Not yet." He had carved the ampersand as a length of ribbon folding back upon itself. The letters were not perfectly aligned. Sophie did not ask him to correct them. They mounted the sign above the door using the original iron brackets. From the road, the new walnut darkened against the brick, modest enough to be missed by anyone moving quickly. That evening, Sophie opened a blank sheet of paper beneath the green-shaded lamp. She dated it, tested the nib, and began with the words Elias had given her. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote that the loom would resist after damp weather. She described the sound a cracked card made before it tore. She recorded where Mr. Grand kept the narrow reed hooks and how Doris preferred beeswax candles because paraffin smoked against the cafe glass. She did not tell the next person what to feel about the house. She wrote what the work required: patience, exactness, and the willingness to stop when tired hands began making careless choices. Before folding the letter, Sophie added the names of those who had helped without asking ownership in return. Evelyn Vargas, Samuel Grand, Walter Pike, Doris Bell, Caleb Ortiz, Reverend Boyd. June and Arthur appeared at the bottom. Because directions given in winter also belonged to the record, History is woven by the quiet hands of those who refuse to give up. She placed the letter beneath the sealed cash and turned the cedar disc until the hidden latch settled. Then she ran one final ribbon through the loom, cream silk with a black edge, and left it wound loosely around the breastbeam for hands she would never meet. Outside, water moved beyond the warehouses. On the a chickadee crossed from the walnut to the roof, and the repaired glass held the last light without leaking it onto the floor. The silk ribbon loom house waits. It has always waited. At the county clerk's office, the $2 bill remained beneath Evelyn Vargas's glassed paperweight, faded now along its fold. New clerks occasionally asked why it had never been deposited. Mrs. Vargas would straighten the deed folders, look toward the old mill district, and say only that some payments were worth keeping.